So, thus far, we have been talking about how to talk about past events. Today's lesson, we're going to talk about how to do two different categories of the preterite. We are going to talk about how to do irregular in yo and irregular stem changing. So these are two categories of irregular. Now it is important to remember, just like in the present tense, that the ending will not stay the same, right? Because the ending only tells us who is speaking and where we are in time. So when we say that we are irregular in yo or irregular stem changing, what we're saying is that as opposed to the regulars, we have to change the stem slightly in order to put the ending on, or before we can tack on that ending that puts it into the preterite tense. So let's take the second category first because those are the simplest. Remember, right, that when we did these in the present tense, that they were only irregular in the first person singular, so only irregular in the yo form. This remains the same in the preterite. Literally, the category tells you what part of the stem you will change, and that is only the first person. So what is the new pattern that we need to learn on how we would do this in the preterite as opposed to how we would do it in the present tense? Well, here we go. We have three categories of irregular verbs in the first person singular. And that is C becomes QU, G becomes GU, and Z becomes C. Now, these categories are really here for phonetic purposes. If you left the verb as it is, it would not make the same sounds. So for phonetic purposes, we have to change the C to a QU and the G to a GU, etc. So these are three examples of verbs that we would use in each category. Now there are many more in the Spanish language, but you will only be required in this course to learn these 9. So as far as you're concerned, these are the only 9 that are irregular in yo in the preterite. We will have sacar, like the verb sacar, right? C becomes QU, so sacar will become yo saqué. Buscar would be yo busqué. Tocar would be yo toqué. And notice that the accent mark remains even though we have stem changed because the ending doesn't change, right? The endings remain the same. So they will still have accent marks on them. Llegar, G becomes GU, would be, llegar would become yo llegué. Pagar would be yo pagué. Jugar would be yo jugué. And also with Z becomes C, almorzar would be yo almorcé, yo abracé, y yo comencé. So those are just some things to remember. Now remember with this, literally, the rest of the verb does not change. So in all of these, right, it would be yo saqué, but tú sacaste, él sacó, nosotros sacamos, and it would remain completely regular for the rest of the verb. So it's just important to remember the first person in these because that's the part that's going to stem change. The rest of it will function just like a regular verb as it did in the present tense. So now let's take the third category of verb. The third category of verb is irregular stem changing. And what that means literally is that the stem has to change at some point in the verb in order for it to become a conjugated unit. We have two categories of stem changers in the preterite. Now, there's good news and there's bad news with the preterite stem changers. The good news with the preterite stem changers is that they are much easier and much simpler to do than the present tense stem changers. The difficulty with that is that a lot of students find this simplistic method to be confusing because they are so used to stem changing in the present tense. So the good news is that it's simpler. The bad news is that it stem changes completely differently than it does in the present tense. So you can't just reuse that pattern from the present tense and pop it into the preterite and have it be exactly the same. It's actually completely different because it's much simpler and it's much easier to do. And we have less categories and it just works in a much easier way. So the two categories that we have, keeping that in mind, are O becomes U and E becomes I. An important thing to note about preterite stem changers is that not all verbs that stem change in the present tense will stem change in the preterite. So you know that nifty little list of verbs that you learned on how to stem change in the present tense? that list is not necessarily the same for the preterite. So you just have to learn which verbs are going to stem change in the preterite as they are. Let's continue to look at how we would do this stem changing in the preterite to talk about past events. We would only stem change in the third person. Remember how in the present tense we always stem changed inside the boot? Well, in the preterite, we will only stem change in the third person. Some people like to say we will only stem change in the loafer, right? So if the shoe analogy wants to make sense to you, or you want to use another shoe analogy, you can think, well, I'm only going to stem change inside this little loafer here. But really all we're doing is stem changing inside the third person. So it would be yo dormí, tú dormiste, but él durmió. Nosotros dormimos, vosotros dormisteis, ellos durmieron. So just like with the present tense, right? All we're doing when we say that we're stem changing is we are taking out that O and putting in a new vowel. In this case, because we are in the O becomes U category and we only stem change in the third person, only in the third person will we take out the O and pop in that U and then conjugate the verb like normal, okay? Our second category is E becomes I. So we have an example here, preferir, right? It would be yo preferí, tú preferiste, él prefirió. Nosotros preferimos, vosotros preferisteis, ellos prefirieron. So remember, just like with the present, we are always going to use the syllable closest to the ending, which in this case with preferir is this E here. So in the third person, we will take out the E that is closest to the ending and we will replace it with an I, and then we will conjugate the verb like normal. Okay, so notice with these stem changers that the endings are the same, right? Because the endings tell us who is speaking and where we are in time. So these endings are the preterite IR endings, just like we would normally use them. And they have all the same accent marks here also, right? They have all the same accent marks as we would do with any verb that we were conjugating in the first three categories of the preterite. So when you think about these, right, you want to think about just altering the stem slightly, but then using the preterite endings as you normally would. Okay, so the important part to remember is how you would change the stem and where you would change the stem. All right, now that we have learned how to use irregular yos and also stem changers in preterite, that is to talk about the past, what I would like for you to do is just practice a little bit. So on a 3x5 note card, on the first side, I would like you to write one irregular yo in the preterite, right? So for example here, I used sacar, but there are 6 or 7 that you could choose, right? Like jugar or buscar or some other form, right? There are 3 different forms of this, and you can find that in your book. Also, I would like you to try also doing the stem changing preterite on the other side, right? So on the back, I would like you to write one form of each of the stem changing preterites. So O becomes U or E becomes I. I've given you 2 examples here. Obviously, you can't use the examples, but you can try to use other ones and just practice a little bit, putting this into a real context before you get into class. And as always, right, pop it on the corkboard and I will check it whenever I get a chance, and be prepared to share just in case I decide to call on you. And I will see you in class.